They said her beauty could stop a sermon in mid-sentence, and that the devil himself had carved her smile. Seraphina was her name, though most in Montgomery whispered it only after dark. To some, she was the cursed child born under the blood moon of 1829. To others, she was God's punishment for men who mistook ownership for power. But to those who truly knew her, or thought they did, she was simply the woman who had destroyed 3 great Alabama families and vanished without a grave to bear her name. Her story began on the Hale plantation, where the cane fields burned gold under the sun and the cries of the enslaved rose with the morning bells. Seraphina was not like the others. Her mother was a field hand, her father rumored to be the master himself, though no one dared say it aloud. She was taught her letters by the master's daughter, learned the art of silence from her mother, and the art of survival from every cruel thing that ever looked her way. By 16, she had grown into a beauty too dangerous for her own safety. Her skin was the color of wet clay, her hair thick and shining, her eyes deep enough to make even the preacher look twice before quoting scripture. When the mistress of the house fell ill, Seraphina was brought inside to help nurse her, and that was the moment the balance of the Hale household began to tilt. Master Jonathan Hale was a man of discipline, wealth, and hypocrisy. He prayed loudly, punished swiftly, and drank quietly. Yet under his own roof, something awakened that no sermon could save him from. At first it was a glance, the brief kind that burns but pretends not to. Then came longer looks, the brushing of hands, the stillness before sin. What happened next would ruin him. It was said that the mistress's death came too soon, her face pale and her teacup still warm when they found her. The doctor claimed it was fever. The slaves whispered another word, poison. And though no one saw Seraphina touch the cup, they all remembered how her eyes had lingered on it just before serving. Banished from the house in shame and suspicion, she was sold to a neighboring plantation. But wherever she went, ruin followed like her shadow. The overseer there, a brutal man named Thorne, took her as his own property. Within a year, his wife was dead by his hand, and Thorne was found hanging from a pecan tree, the wind swaying his body like a warning. Carved into the bark below him was a single word: Seraphina. By now, Alabama whispered her name as though it carried a curse. Merchants spoke of her beauty in trembling tones. Preachers warned against her from the pulpit. But curiosity is a stronger fire than faith. One wealthy cotton trader from Selma, a man named Mr. Barrett, purchased her next, determined to prove she was no witch, only a woman. He wanted to own the legend, to conquer it. Within months, his marriage collapsed, his business failed, and his fortune bled away into nothing. The people called her the most dangerous slave in Alabama. The name stuck like a brand, and yet the strangest thing about Seraphina was that she never seemed to fight or threaten. She spoke softly, walked gracefully, and smiled when others trembled. She was accused of murder, witchcraft, seduction, but none of her crimes ever touched the law. Men destroyed themselves around her as if she had simply handed them the mirror and let them see what they truly were. In 1851, a physician obsessed with her case claimed she was possessed by the sin of beauty. He took her to a private asylum near Tuscaloosa to study her. 3 weeks later, he was found dead in his office, eyes wide open, his body untouched, a black ribbon tied around his wrist. Seraphina was gone. Some say she escaped into the swamp that night, barefoot and singing the hymn the mistress once taught her. Others claim she drowned and that her ghost still walks the old road to Montgomery when the moon is high and the air tastes like rain. But one thing was certain. Wherever Seraphina went, peace died, and yet, those who looked beyond the whispers saw something else, not a monster, not a witch, but a woman who had learned to weaponize her only freedom, herself. They said the devil made her, but maybe the devil only taught her how to survive. The first time anyone saw Seraphina, she was crying without sound. Her mother had just given birth in the dirt-floored quarters behind the Hale plantation, and the night was heavy with thunder. The midwife whispered prayers while the storm shook the cypress trees. When the lightning flashed, it lit the newborn's face, not screaming, not gasping, just staring. eyes wide open, unblinking, as if she had arrived already aware of the cruelty of the world she'd been born into. Her mother, Ada, was one of the oldest field hands, a woman of quiet strength and strange wisdom. She had once been sold 3 times, whipped twice, and widowed once. She called her child Seraphina after the angels said to guard the throne of God, though she laughed bitterly when she said it. "Ain't no angel gonna come down here, baby," she whispered. "You best learn to guard yourself." Seraphina grew up among the cotton fields, barefoot and watchful. She rarely spoke, but she listened to everything. The songs of the women picking cotton, the whispers of the men plotting escape, the laughter of the white children on the veranda. The other slaves said she had the look, that same quiet danger her mother carried, the kind that made men nervous and women curious. By 10, she was already different. The master's daughter, Miss Eliza Hale, noticed her quick mind and decided she should learn house manners. So Seraphina was brought into the big house, the world of lace curtains, polished floors, and quiet hatred. There, she learned to read in secret from discarded prayer books. She memorized every word, every line, as if scripture could become armor. It was Miss Eliza who taught her letters, but it was Seraphina who understood their power. When she read aloud, her voice carried a rhythm that made even the birds pause outside the window. There was something in her, an intelligence too sharp for her station, a grace too deliberate for her age. The mistress of the house, Mrs. Margaret Hale, noticed. She told her husband, Jonathan Hale, that the child made her uneasy. "She's got eyes that see too much," the mistress said one night. "No child should look at a grown man like she's measuring his worth." Jonathan dismissed it with a laugh, but the seed had been planted. Fear, quiet, unspoken, began to take root in that house long before Seraphina became a woman. As she grew older, her beauty became the kind that made silence fall in a room. Her skin held the warmth of dusk. Her hair shimmered like black silk in candlelight. Her voice, soft, low, certain, could soothe a crying child or still an argument. The other servants called her the still water, because you never knew how deep it ran. When she turned 15, Ada fell ill from fever and was gone within days. They buried her under the magnolia trees behind the fields. That night, Seraphina sat alone by the grave until dawn, unmoving, whispering something no one could hear. From that day forward, she changed. She became quiet, not out of fear but focus. She moved through the Hale house like a shadow, watching everything, saying nothing. She saw the way Jonathan Hale drank himself to sleep, the way his wife clutched her pearls when she prayed, the way Eliza dreamed of marrying a man who would never come. Seraphina saw their loneliness, their secrets, their weaknesses, and she stored each one away like coins in a hidden purse. It began innocently enough. Jonathan would call her to bring his pipe, to light the candles, to fetch the ledger. But there were moments, fleeting, forbidden, when his hand lingered too long as he passed her the quill, or his eyes followed her when she walked away. She never smiled, never spoke beyond, "Yes, master," but the silence between them grew louder with every passing week. Mrs. Hale noticed. She began to pray louder, to complain more, to scold her husband with trembling fury. But the more she raged, the colder he became, and the colder he became, the warmer he grew toward the girl with the still eyes. One night, the house fell into silence, except for the rain tapping against the glass. Seraphina had been sent to deliver tea to Mrs. Hale, who was bedridden. She set the tray down gently, her hands steady despite the mistress's glare. "You think I don't see it?" Mrs. Hale hissed. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" Seraphina said nothing. Her silence was not submission. It was power. The mistress's hand trembled as she reached for the cup. "You'll bring ruin to this house," she spat. That night, Mrs. Hale's screams echoed through the halls. The doctor came in haste, but by dawn she was gone. They said it was fever, a sudden, merciless one. But the servants whispered of something else. They said the tea smelled strange that night. They said Seraphina didn't cry. When the sun rose, she stood by the window in her plain dress, the light touching her face like judgment. Jonathan Hale looked at her for a long time, and whatever humanity remained in him cracked. He sold her within the week, claiming he couldn't bear to see the ghost of his wife in the same house. But deep down he knew he wasn't fleeing a ghost. He was fleeing guilt. The overseer who bought her didn't know the story, or pretended not to. But he soon would. Seraphina carried with her the calm of someone who had already survived fire. She had learned without words that beauty and silence were her weapons, and that the world would destroy itself around her if she only stood still and let it. In time, she would come to understand what her mother had meant that first night. Angels don't come down here, but demons? Sometimes they wear the face of a girl who never learned to scream. The Hale plantation sat like a monument to pride. White pillars, green shutters, and 1,000 acres of cotton that shimmered like ghosts under the moon. But behind its beauty lived rot. Jonathan Hale, the master, was the sort of man who believed ownership was proof of righteousness. He prayed loud enough for the slaves to hear, not God. His wife Margaret, fragile in both body and spirit, had long accepted that she shared her husband with his appetites. Still, she held her dignity like fine china, cracked but unbroken. Seraphina entered their lives as a shadow, a housegirl meant to clean, carry, and keep her eyes down. But her silence had weight. Her beauty unsettled the walls. Her presence made the air itself hold its breath. There was no defiance in her movements, no rebellion in her words. Only the quiet control of someone who knew exactly how much space her existence occupied. At first, Jonathan avoided her. He was too aware of the whispers, that she was the devil's own daughter, that misfortune followed her. But temptation has a rhythm, and Seraphina's stillness was music. He would call for her late at night when the house was asleep. Small things at first. To refill his glass, to trim the lamp, to bring a ledger from the study. Each time she obeyed in silence, her eyes steady and unreadable. One evening, as the rain battered the windows and the fire burned low, he looked at her too long. "You're not like the others," he said softly. She did not answer. "You understand me," he continued, as if convincing himself. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, calm, dangerous. "I understand what men want, master." He laughed nervously, but her words cut through him like a blade. That night, he dreamed of her face, and the dreams grew darker each time. Mrs. Hale began to notice the changes. Her husband's short temper, his restless nights, the way his prayers grew longer. She started locking her bedroom door, praying harder, and watching Seraphina from across the parlor with eyes full of unspoken dread. The other servants whispered that the mistress's sickness had worsened since the new girl came inside. One afternoon, when the heat lay heavy on the plantation, Margaret Hale summoned Seraphina. "Sit," she ordered, though her voice trembled. Seraphina obeyed. The mistress studied her face for a long moment. "Do you know what you are?" she asked. Seraphina tilted her head. "A servant, ma'am." The mistress's lips tightened. "No," she said. "You're temptation. You make good men weak. You make God turn his face away." Seraphina said nothing, and that silence, that unbearable calm, made the mistress's hands shake. "If I die," she whispered, "my blood will be on your soul." Seraphina looked at her then, truly looked. "Souls belong to the ones who own themselves," she said. That night, thunder rolled over Alabama. The house creaked as if remembering sins. Jonathan sat by the fire, the ledger open but unread. His wife was upstairs, coughing weakly, the sound like paper tearing. Seraphina stood in the doorway, the light behind her throwing her shadow across the floor. "You should rest, master," she said softly. He turned toward her, eyes glazed with exhaustion and drink. "You speak to me like I'm yours," he murmured. "I speak to you like I know what you are," she replied. Something broke inside him. Not anger, not lust, but the awful realization that this girl, this property, saw him more clearly than God ever had. He rose, crossed the room, and for a moment the air between them seemed to hold the world's last breath. When his hand brushed her cheek, she didn't move. She only said, "You'll pay for this one way or another." The next morning, Margaret Hale was found dead in her bed. Her teacup lay spilled beside her hand, the faint smell of almonds hanging in the air. The doctor called it fever. The servants called it judgment. Jonathan called it an accident. But deep in his chest, he knew better. He buried her beneath the oak grove, a fine headstone and a fine speech, while Seraphina watched from the shadows of the veranda. She wore no expression. Her eyes followed him the whole time, not with pity, but with knowing. Days turned into weeks. Jonathan grew gaunt and paranoid. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping. He burned his wife's letters, smashed her mirror, and drank from morning till night. When he looked at Seraphina, he saw the ghost of his sin smiling back at him. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, he sold her. "Take her away," he told the trader. "She brings death." The men who loaded her onto the wagon spat at her feet, but she never flinched. As the plantation disappeared behind her, she turned her head once, just once, and whispered something no one could hear. Some say it was a prayer. Others said it was a curse. Jonathan Hale died 6 months later. They found him alone in his study, surrounded by empty bottles and torn pages. His last journal entry read, "She looked at me once, and I have not known peace since." And somewhere far away, under another master's roof, Seraphina smiled faintly in her sleep. She had learned her first truth, that power was not in strength or status or skin. It was in knowing where to place your silence. The first family had fallen. 2 more waited, though they did not know it yet. The wagon that carried Seraphina from the Hale plantation rolled for 2 days through red Alabama clay and endless pine. The trader who owned her said little, but the way he stared made her skin crawl. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just sat straight, her wrists bound, watching the road wind toward whatever new hell awaited. Her new master was not a man of refinement like Jonathan Hale. His name was Elias Thorne, an overseer who had purchased her from a passing broker with the promise that she'd make fine work indoors. Thorne was a hard, cruel man, not rich, but powerful in the small, merciless ways men crave to be. He ruled the Whitaker plantation on behalf of an aging owner too drunk to stand, and in his hands, punishment was sport. When Seraphina arrived, the quarters were alive with whispers. The women stared. The men looked away. Some had heard her story. The girl who had brought death to the Hale family, the one who could make a man lose his soul just by looking at her. The whispers called her cursed, but in Thorne's eyes, she was a challenge. He was determined to break her. From the start, he made her work twice as long, eat half as much, and endure his leering presence every night when he patrolled the quarters. Yet no matter what cruelty he inflicted, Seraphina never begged. She moved through pain like smoke, untouchable, shapeless, free in ways that infuriated him. One evening, Thorne came to her cabin. "You think you're better than me," he said, his breath thick with whiskey. "I own you, you hear? You belong to me." Seraphina looked up from the small fire she was tending, her face calm. "Then you should be careful how you treat what you own," she replied quietly. He struck her hard across the face, but she didn't cry out. He expected tears, perhaps fear, maybe even hate. What he saw instead was worse, pity. That look haunted him. Over the following weeks, Thorne grew obsessed. He found excuses to summon her to the main house, cleaning, serving, sewing. His wife, Clara Thorne, a weary woman with trembling hands and haunted eyes, noticed the changes immediately. Her husband's temper grew wild. His patience with the other workers vanished. Clara approached Seraphina one morning. "He'll destroy you," she said, voice trembling. Seraphina looked at her and whispered, "No, ma'am." "He'll destroy himself." It began one night in midsummer. The air was thick and heavy, the kind that made tempers flare and hearts burn. Thorne found Seraphina in the yard, washing clothes by the light of the moon. "You think you can control me?" He slurred. "I think you've already lost control," she said softly. The silence that followed was like the moment before a storm breaks. Then came the violence, loud, desperate, clumsy. But when it was over, something in Thorne's eyes had changed. He staggered back, shaking, as if realizing what he had done. The next morning, Clara Thorne was found dead, her body twisted at the foot of the stairs. The household said she'd fallen, but the bruises around her neck told a different story. Elias Thorne shut himself in his room for 3 days, refusing food, muttering to himself, and drinking until his eyes turned hollow. When he finally emerged, he looked 10 years older. He ordered the workers to dig a grave under the pecan tree and bury her there. No one said a word, but everyone watched Seraphina, standing still as stone, her expression unreadable. That night, the wind carried strange sounds from the overseer's quarters. A man shouting, weeping, begging someone unseen for forgiveness. By dawn, the plantation was silent. Elias Thorne's body hung from the lowest branch of the pecan tree, swaying gently in the morning light. His boots had fallen off and his face was twisted in terror. Carved into the bark beneath him were 2 words, scrawled deep by a trembling hand, "Forgive me." And below that, faintly etched as if traced by someone else's hand, a single name, Seraphina. When the master of the estate finally sobered enough to take notice, he sent word for Seraphina to be sold again. "She brings bad luck," he muttered. "Death follows her like a dog." As she was led away, the plantation hands watched in silence. None dared speak, but every soul who'd seen the overseer's madness knew that something far deeper than chance was at work. On the wagon out, the driver asked her, "You got a death wish, girl? Everywhere you go, somebody ends up in the ground." Seraphina turned to him, her voice calm as ever. "They bury themselves," she said. The driver shivered and didn't speak again. For days afterward, the Whitaker workers claimed they could still hear the sound of a woman humming near the pecan tree at night. The same tune Clara Thorne used to sing while she hung laundry. A lullaby for the living, or perhaps for the damned. By the time Seraphina reached her next destination, the estate of Mr. Barrett, a wealthy cotton merchant in Selma, her legend had already arrived before her. Men whispered, women crossed themselves, and preachers spoke her name as if it were a warning. But Seraphina had learned something powerful. She didn't need to touch a man to destroy him. All she needed was patience. The world was full of men waiting to ruin themselves. She only had to be there when they did. The second family had fallen. One to madness, one to guilt, both to their own hands, and somewhere deep in her heart, Seraphina began to understand her purpose. She was not born to serve. She was born to remind men of their sins, one house, one soul at a time. When the wagon reached Selma, it was near dusk, and the air carried the heavy perfume of cotton and decay. The streets glimmered with the last light of day, and on the corner of Broad Street stood the grand Barrett mansion, 3 stories of whitewashed pride built upon the backs of the enslaved. Mr. Charles Barrett was not like Seraphina's former masters. He was polished, eloquent, and dangerously intelligent, a merchant whose charm opened doors and whose money kept them shut. He had heard the stories about her. Everyone had. The girl who had cursed 2 households, who left death in her wake. But Barrett was a man who did not believe in curses, only in control. "I'll take her," he said when she was brought to the slave market. His tone was calm, confident, the voice of a man who thought he could master anything. The broker warned him, "She ain't right, sir." "Something follows that one," Barrett smiled. "Then let it follow me." Seraphina was taken into the mansion and placed among the house servants. Mrs. Barrett, a fair woman of gentle heart but frail constitution, took pity on her. "You'll have no trouble here," she told Seraphina kindly. "My husband believes in fairness." Fairness, Seraphina learned, was a matter of convenience. Barrett treated his slaves with civility in public, well-dressed, well-fed, obedient, but beneath that veneer lay the same sickness she'd seen in every man who thought he owned another soul. He spoke kindly to her at first, even complimented her grace. "You have an uncommon presence," he told her once while she polished silver. "Almost noble. She said nothing. Her silence made him curious, and curiosity is the most dangerous form of desire. In the beginning, Barrett's attention was discreet. Long glances during supper, an extra word of praise before guests. Then came small commands meant to draw her near, lighting his pipe, tending to his library, fetching brandy late at night. Mrs. Barrett noticed. Wives always notice. Her kindness grew colder. The gentle tone hardened. One night she found Seraphina dusting in the study and said sharply, "You think I don't see what you're doing?" Seraphina looked up slowly. "I don't do anything, ma'am." "That's what makes it worse," the woman hissed before turning away. Within months, the house began to rot, not physically, but spiritually. The Barretts' only son, a boy of 13, drowned in the river under strange circumstances. He'd gone swimming with other boys and never come up. Mrs. Barrett fell ill soon after, her body wasting away from grief. She accused her husband of bringing a curse into the house. "That girl!" she cried from her sickbed. "She walks with death beside her." But Barrett, ever the rational man, refused to believe in fate. He visited Seraphina's quarters that same night, his composure cracking. "Tell me," he said, his voice low, "what do you do to them? The others, Hale, Thorne, what did you do?" Seraphina looked at him with eyes too calm for the question. "Nothing they didn't already do to themselves." Barrett's hand trembled as he reached out, not in violence, but in fascination. "You're a witch," he whispered. She smiled faintly. "No, just a mirror." After that night, Barrett changed. He began to neglect his business, ignore his partners, and spend long hours wandering his fields like a man half asleep. He stopped attending church, grew pale and erratic, muttering about destiny and damnation. Mrs. Barrett's condition worsened until she could no longer rise from her bed. The servants whispered that he had made some secret pact with the girl. Others said he'd lost his mind. One rainy evening, he summoned Seraphina to his office. The air smelled of whiskey and ink. "You've undone me," he said bitterly. "Everything I've built, gone. My wife, my son, my mind." Seraphina stood before him, her hands folded neatly. "I warned you once," she said softly. "You should be careful how you treat what you own." Barrett slammed his fist against the desk. "You're nothing but a slave." Her eyes lifted, steady and unflinching. "Then why are you the one in chains?" The thunder outside cracked like divine punctuation. Barrett stumbled back, his breath ragged. He reached for the pistol on his desk, the same one he'd used to threaten runaways, but his hand shook too much to aim. "I could kill you," he rasped. "You already have," she whispered. The gun went off. The servants came running. They found Mr. Barrett dead, the pistol still in his hand, his eyes open and staring toward the doorway. There was no blood on Seraphina, only the faint reflection of lightning across her face as she watched them lift his body away. Mrs. Barrett died 3 days later. Some said she never knew her husband was gone. Others swore she died screaming his name. When the estate was divided, the creditors found little left. Debts, ledgers, the faint ruin of a fortune once envied across Alabama. Among the possessions auctioned was Seraphina herself, her value reduced on paper to half her worth, her name written beside a simple note. Trouble follows her. But no one wanted to buy her. Even hardened traders refused. "I'd rather buy a coffin," one muttered. "At least I know what's inside it." For a brief time, she lived unclaimed, drifting between markets, passed from one hesitant hand to another. But her reputation had grown beyond the flesh. She had become a myth, whispered in parlors, taverns, and church pews alike. Some called her the Widowmaker, others the Devil's Handmaiden. But among the enslaved, she was something else, the avenger no man could chain. The third family was gone. 3 houses ruined, 3 graves dug, and yet she carried no joy from it. Only the slow-burning realization that freedom, the kind she wanted, would never come from another man's death. It had to be taken, not granted. One night, as rain fell over Selma, Seraphina walked away from the camp where she'd been held. No one saw her go. By morning, the road was empty, her chains left behind in the mud. The merchants said she had fled north. The preachers said she had vanished into hell, but those who had seen her last swore the truth was simpler. She had disappeared into the Alabama swamps, singing softly, her voice carrying the tune of a lullaby known only to the dead. And somewhere in that darkness, her legend began to change. She was no longer just a woman. She was a storm in human form, and Alabama had not seen its last of her. By 1851, the story of Seraphina the cursed slave had spread far beyond Alabama's borders. Merchants whispered her name in taverns, preachers used her as a sermon warning, and mothers told their daughters to avoid looking too long into any mirror at night, for fear they might see her reflection staring back. No plantation wanted her. No trader dared to claim her. But one man, a physician named Dr. Silas Wyndham, saw opportunity in her infamy. Wyndham ran a small private asylum on the outskirts of Tuscaloosa, a place that called itself a hospital for the morally deranged. It was a sprawling brick building surrounded by iron gates and magnolia trees, smelling faintly of camphor and despair. Inside, men and women were kept in rooms with barred windows, their cries muffled by the hymns sung in the chapel next door. Dr. Wyndham prided himself on studying peculiar minds. He believed sin could be cured if dissected like a disease. When he heard of Seraphina, he wrote to the authorities, offering to take her in. "The girl's condition," he wrote, "is not criminal. It is pathological. She is the product of moral decay and superstition. I can cure her." She was brought to him in chains. The first thing Wyndham noticed was her stillness. "You don't look dangerous," he said, his pen scratching across a notebook. Seraphina looked up, her voice calm. Dangerous things never do. He smiled thinly, certain he could break her like a specimen under glass. In the beginning, the doctor treated her with curiosity. He questioned her daily, measuring her pulse as she spoke, taking notes on her expressions. "Do you believe you have powers?" he asked. "I believe men give me theirs," she answered. He called her delusional. She called him predictable. Wyndham's fascination grew until it slipped into obsession. He spent hours in his office rereading his notes, sketching her face from memory. He told himself it was scientific, but the hunger behind his eyes betrayed him. The asylum staff noticed the change, the way he dismissed other patients, how he began locking his office door when she was inside. "Seraphina," he said one evening, pacing the floor, "you've been the ruin of 3 men. Do you feel guilt? Do you feel guilt for the ones you call insane?" She replied. He laughed nervously. "You twist words like a serpent. I will cure you of this pride. Then who will cure you of yours?" The air in the room thickened. He dismissed her back to her cell but couldn't sleep that night. Her words had followed him into his dreams, where he saw her eyes glowing in the dark like embers. Days turned into weeks. He began experimenting with moral isolation, keeping her alone for long periods in silence. But when he returned to question her, she was always the same, calm, unbroken, watching him with a gaze that stripped him bare. His journal from that time, recovered years later, contained fragments of madness. "She does not eat. She does not weep. Her eyes see through me. I feel her thoughts pressing upon mine. She must be the embodiment of temptation, yet she acts as if she is mercy itself. I dream of her voice. It sings in my head when I wake." The staff whispered that the doctor was changing, pale, hollow-eyed, pacing the halls at night. One nurse swore she saw him talking to an empty chair in his office, as though Seraphina sat before him when she was locked away. Then, one stormy evening, the guards heard shouting from the doctor's study. When they forced the door open, they found Dr. Wyndham slumped over his desk, his eyes wide open and unseeing. There was no wound, no mark, no sign of struggle. On his wrist was tied a black ribbon, knotted twice. On his desk lay an open page from his journal, smeared with ink and trembling handwriting. "She has shown me myself, and there is no cure." Seraphina was gone. The asylum was searched for days, every corridor, every field. They found her chains discarded beneath a magnolia tree behind the chapel. Beyond that, nothing. No footprints, no trace. Some said she escaped into the woods, guided by the storm. Others whispered that she was never truly human, that she had come to collect the doctor's soul as payment for trying to own hers. Within weeks, the asylum fell into ruin. Patients screamed at night that they could hear a woman singing in the halls, though no one was there. The staff resigned one by one until the building was abandoned entirely. Years later, travelers passing by claimed they saw her standing by the old gate in a tattered white dress, her hair wild, her eyes full of firelight. One man said she spoke to him in a whisper carried on the wind. Freedom isn't given, it's taken, and sometimes it costs everything. The asylum became a legend, its walls sinking into ivy and silence. But among those who remembered, Seraphina's story had changed once again. She was no longer just a cursed slave or a seductress. She was the haunting embodiment of justice in a world that never knew the meaning of it. Dr. Wyndham's notes were later published in a medical journal under the Yay title, Case Study, The Woman of Moral Possession, the Yay. Last line of the article, perhaps added by another hand, read simply, "The patient remains unaccounted for. The doctor's death unexplained." And in the margins of that same article, found decades later in a collector's attic, was a small, handwritten edition in faded ink. She told me once that every man carries the asylum inside him. After Dr. Wyndham's mysterious death, Seraphina's name passed into legend, but not all legends stay buried. In the decades that followed, travelers, farmers, and fugitive slaves whispered of a dark woman seen wandering the old Tuscaloosa road barefoot, her shadow stretching longer than her body, her humming soft and hollow like the sound of something ancient remembering itself. No official record listed her escape. No bounty notice bore her name. Yet every man in Alabama seemed to know of her, the dangerous slave who destroyed 3 families and a doctor's mind, then vanished like smoke into the swamp. Those who searched for her never found a body, a trail, or even a clue. But strange signs began to surface. In the parish records of a small church near Demopolis, a preacher wrote, "A woman came at night seeking confession. She said she'd taken the sins of 5 men and carried them in her chest like stones. She wept not for them, but for the world that made them." He never named her, but beside his note was a single sketch. A pair of dark eyes, calm and unreadable. Beneath it, one word, Seraphina. As years passed, her name became a story told to frighten the cruel. Overseers whispered her name when storms approached. White women invoked it when they feared their husbands' wandering eyes. Among the enslaved, she was no longer just a woman, she was a warning, a hope, and a curse all at once. They said she had become part of the swamp, that her spirit moved through the trees like mist, watching, waiting, choosing who deserved mercy and who deserved ruin. Some called her the Shade, others the Widow in White. But there were also those who claimed to have met her, old men who swore they'd seen her eyes glow beneath the cypress trees. One such man, an escaped slave named Benjamin Crow, gave his account decades later to an abolitionist writer. "I seen her once, I did, down by the river bend near Greensboro. Thought she was a ghost till she spoke. Said I ought to keep walking north and never look back. I asked her name. She said, 'Names are for graves.' Then she walked into the water and the water never moved." Stories like his spread fast, especially after the war began to turn the South inside out. Soldiers wrote of seeing a strange woman on battle roads, tending to the dying, whispering prayers in a voice both tender and terrible. One Confederate captain swore she appeared beside his tent the night before his company was slaughtered. "She touched my hand," he said, "and I knew then I wouldn't live to see another sunrise." But it wasn't only men who saw her. Women began dreaming of her. Slave mothers told their daughters that Seraphina was still alive, watching over them from beyond the swamps. "If a man ever tries to own your body," they'd whisper, "remember her name. Let it burn in his mouth." To the white South, Seraphina became a curse, an invisible ghost that haunted the old plantations long after the whips went silent. To the black South, she became something closer to a saint, a spirit of vengeance wrapped in mercy, reminding them that even in bondage, There was power in the fire of a woman wronged. Years later, when freedom finally came on paper, an aging preacher in Mobile claimed he saw her again. She was standing at the back of the church, he said, wearing a white dress that didn't belong to this earth. She smiled when the children sang. When I looked again, she was gone. But every candle in the church burned brighter. He wrote her into his journal as Sister Sarah. The entry was dated 1865. As the Reconstruction years dragged on, newspapers printed ghost stories about the Barrett Mansion, the Thorne Estate, and the old asylum. Locals swore they saw her face in the windows when lightning struck. Others claimed they heard her singing the same mournful hymn, as if she were reminding the living that sins don't die with the sinner. A journalist from New Orleans, visiting the ruins of the asylum, found a single chain buried beneath a magnolia tree. Around it, the earth smelled of iron and smoke. He wrote, "The air was still, but I felt her there, not as a ghost, but as a presence that refused to vanish. Some souls, it seems, do not wait for judgment. Even the state records began to reflect her myth. Under fugitive slaves, unrecovered, 1851-1860, her file bore a simple final note written in faded ink, presumed dead. Unconfirmed sightings suggest otherwise. By the turn of the century, her name had become folklore. Yet every so often, someone would find something. A black ribbon tied to a gatepost, a hymn book left open to the verse about freedom and fire, or footprints leading into the swamp and disappearing mid-step. An old woman in Selma, interviewed in 1898, told the last known story. They said she was cursed, but I don't think so. I think she just learned to live without fear. They called her the devil, but maybe she just stopped praying to men who acted like gods." The interviewer asked if she truly believed Seraphina still walked the earth. The woman smiled sadly. "Child, the world still ain't right. That means she's still walking." And perhaps she was. Sometimes when thunder rolls over Alabama and the air smells of wet earth, people still claim to hear her humming. The old song again, the one the Hale mistress once taught her, the one she sang for the dying. No one knows where she went. No one ever will. But one truth remains certain. She never belonged to any man, any master, or any grave. Seraphina had become eternal, a spirit born from chains, carrying the memory of every injustice like a crown of fire, and in every whispered story, every trembling prayer, every quiet act of defiance, her name still breathes. Seraphina, the most dangerous woman Alabama ever knew, the woman who refused to die. In the years that followed the Civil War, Alabama became a graveyard of broken mansions and buried sins. The fields that once rang with the cries of the enslaved were silent now, overgrown with vines and rusted tools, the ghosts of empire whispering through the cotton stalks. Yet some said not all ghosts stayed quiet. It began in 1872, 21 years after Seraphina's disappearance. The town of Greensboro was struggling to rise from ruin. Freedmen's schools had opened, churches stood where auction blocks once did, and yet fear still lived in the bones of the land. The white families who had survived the war spoke in hushed tones about new hauntings, things that came not from guiltless spirits, but from memories that refused to die. One evening, a farmer named Jacob Hensley rode into town pale as chalk. He swore that while working his fields at dusk, he saw a woman standing at the edge of the tree line, barefoot, her dress torn but shining white in the fading light. "She was watching me," he said. "Didn't move, didn't blink. I called out, but the wind took my voice." The sheriff laughed it off as superstition, but Hensley wasn't the only one. Over the next weeks, others began to tell the same story. A dark-skinned woman seen wandering the ruins of old plantations, her voice humming an unholy tune. Dogs howled when she passed. Candles blew out without wind. Some said she was the ghost of a wronged woman come back for vengeance. Others whispered her true name, Seraphina. In that same year, a traveling preacher named Reverend Josiah Pike claimed to have encountered her near the burned remains of the Hale plantation. "She walked from the smoke like an angel made of sorrow," he told his congregation. "Said the land still cries for what it's done." He fainted before he could finish his sermon. When he awoke, his hair had turned white as snow. The story spread like fire through the South. Journalists from Montgomery to Savannah came searching for proof. None found it, but all returned uneasy. One even wrote in his paper, "I do not believe in ghosts, but I believe in her. Whatever she was, she left the earth different." By autumn, the whispers had taken shape, not just haunting, but retribution. Every man known for cruelty, for rebuilding the slave trade through debt and law, began to meet strange fates. A merchant drowned in his own well. A former overseer was found hanging from a magnolia tree with no ladder in sight. Each scene bore the same mark, a black ribbon tied somewhere nearby. To the new generation of freed people, the meaning was clear. Seraphina had returned, not as flesh, not as spirit, but as justice itself. One night, a young teacher named Evelyn Green, who taught at a freedmen's school outside Demopolis, claimed that a stranger came to her door. She asked if the children knew how to write their names, Evelyn said. "I told her yes, ma'am, they do." She smiled, said that was good. "Names are power," she told me. "They keep you from disappearing." Then she was gone. The next morning, Evelyn found a ribbon tied to the school gate. Black silk, smooth as shadow. The old people said the ribbon was her blessing, a sign that Seraphina walked among them still, guarding what freedom had been bought with blood. But not everyone welcomed her legend. White preachers condemned the tale from their pulpits, calling it devil's work. "The devil wears a woman's face to fool the weak," one shouted in Selma. But his congregation never saw him again after that sermon. His church was found empty the next morning, its doors wide open, the Bible split to the verse that read, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." No one spoke his name after that. The sightings continued. Near the ruins of the asylum, travelers swore they saw candlelight moving between the trees, flickering in rhythm like someone walking with purpose. A wagon driver passing by claimed he saw her standing beside the crumbling walls, her face turned toward the moon. He said she looked neither young nor old, only timeless, as if time itself bent to her will. He tried to speak to her, but she raised one hand and his voice vanished from his throat. When he reached town, he could not utter a single word for the rest of his life. The world had changed, but Alabama's soul had not. And Seraphina, whether ghost or myth or woman, had come back to remind them. By the time the century neared its end, she had become something greater than fear. She was faith. Among the descendants of those who had once been enslaved, prayers were whispered to her name. "Sarah, watch over me," mothers would murmur before sleep. "Sarah, keep the chains from my children." The name became sacred, though no church dared claim it. Meanwhile, in the dusty halls of history, the scholars tried to bury her story under paper and doubt. They called her a fabrication of folklore. They said there was no record, no proof, no evidence. But that was the thing about Seraphina. She had always lived between the lines, where no record could reach her. A century would pass before her story surfaced again in the testimony of a dying man. He was a descendant of Dr. Silas Wyndham, the asylum doctor. On his deathbed, he confessed to his grandson, "My grandfather didn't die of fright." He saw her. She came to him to take what he owed. He said her eyes were not human. They were made of memory. That confession reignited the legend. Writers, preachers, and dreamers began to search for her truth, and in doing so, found something darker, the reflection of their own guilt, stretching across generations, because the truth was never whether Seraphina lived or died. The truth was that she refused to be erased. Every century needs its ghost to remember the crimes it would rather forget. And in the South, that ghost wore the face of a woman who had turned her pain into a curse powerful enough to outlast the men who made it. Seraphina had returned, not to haunt, but to remind that even in death, she could not be silenced, that every scream, every chain, every hidden sin still echoed her name. And somewhere, deep in the wet earth of Alabama, beneath the vines and bones of a forgotten asylum, her voice still sang through the magnolia trees, soft, steady, and eternal. "You can burn the house. You can bury the bodies, but you cannot kill what remembers. By the turn of the century, Alabama had changed on the surface. New railways cut through cotton fields, and brick schools rose where auction houses once stood. But beneath the red clay, nothing truly changed. The earth still kept its secrets, and one of those secrets had a name: Seraphina. In 1901, a young historian from Birmingham named Clara Wyndham began researching folklore of the Reconstruction South her professor had dismissed. The local stories of the Black Widow of Montgomery County as superstition. A slave woman turned myth by ignorant tongues, he'd said. But Clara had always been drawn to the forbidden, and the whispers about Seraphina stirred something deeper than academic curiosity. Her great-grandfather, Dr. Silas Wyndham, had once run an asylum in Tuscaloosa, the same place where Seraphina had supposedly been treated. Her family never spoke of him. When she asked her father why, he simply replied, "Some graves are better left closed." But Clara didn't believe in leaving things buried. In the spring of that year, she traveled to Tuscaloosa armed with a notebook and a nervous heart. The asylum had long been abandoned, its walls strangled by ivy, its halls filled with the stink of mold and history. Inside, she found shattered bottles, rusted restraints, and patient logs that had melted from years of rain. Yet tucked behind a loose brick in her great-grandfather's office, she discovered something else: a leather-bound diary, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a black ribbon. The first page was written in a steady, elegant hand. "This record is not for the world. It is for the truth that men deny." Clara's pulse quickened as she turned the brittle pages. The diary told of a patient admitted in 1849, identified only as S. Her description matched every legend: dark skin, green eyes, of unusual intelligence and calm disposition. The doctor had noted her refusal to speak, to eat, or to respond to treatment. But between the sterile notes, the entries grew stranger. The subject hums a tune at night. The others fall silent when she begins. When I speak of God, she smiles, but not kindly. Last night I dreamed she stood over me. I awoke to find her handprint on my chest. Then came the final entry, scrawled with shaking pen. She has shown me my sins. She said she does not kill, she remembers. I understand now. Tomorrow I will confess everything. If I do not, she will. The remaining pages were blank. Clara sat frozen, the diary trembling in her hands. For the first time, she felt the weight of the stories she had dismissed. Her ancestor hadn't been a doctor. He'd been a prisoner of something far older, something that lived beyond science or faith. When she returned to her hotel that night, she couldn't sleep. The air was heavy, thick with summer humidity, and a silence that pressed against her chest. Near midnight, she heard humming, low and steady, like the vibration of a hymn. She thought it was the wind, until she recognized the melody. It was the same song that appeared in every account of Seraphina's haunting. She rose, went to the window and saw, through the fog and gaslight, a figure standing by the riverbank. Barefoot, in a white dress, hair long as shadow, Clara's breath caught. The woman raised her head, and even across the distance their eyes met. For a long moment the world held still. Then, as if the night itself exhaled, the figure turned and vanished into the fog. The next morning, Clara went back to the asylum. She dug where the floor had collapsed in the eastern wing, following some instinct that wasn't her own. 3 feet down, she struck wood. It was an old trunk, rotted but intact. Inside, beneath scraps of clothing and cracked glass jars, lay a single object wrapped in linen, a small silver locket. She opened it. Inside was a faded sketch of a woman, unmistakably Seraphina, and a lock of real hair. Beneath it, engraved so faintly she almost missed it, were the words, "I do not die, I wait." Clara left the asylum shaken to her core. That night she returned to Birmingham and sealed the diary and locket in a chest beneath her floorboards. She told no one. But her sleep was never her own again. Neighbors claimed they heard her talking to someone in her study late at night. When asked, she'd say softly, "Just history visiting." Within a year, she stopped teaching. Within 2, she was found dead at her desk, her face serene, and on the table before her, the diary lay open to a blank page, except it wasn't blank, written in fresh ink. In a different hand were 6 words. She remembers. So must you, child. Clara's death made the newspapers. The coroner ruled it heart failure, but her housekeeper swore that every mirror in the house had shattered that morning, as if something unseen had passed through. The diary and the locket disappeared from evidence. They say her spirit still lingers in the archives of Birmingham University, where her research notes are kept, pages filled with symbols and words no one can decipher. Some scholars say it's gibberish. Others, who've stared too long, say the words begin to rearrange themselves when you look away. Over the years, strange things continued to happen. Descendants of the Wyndham line reported hearing the same humming in their sleep. Some saw a woman standing at the foot of their bed, never threatening, only watching. The legend said that Seraphina's bloodline had merged with her captors through vengeance, fate, or something beyond understanding. In Alabama, where blood and memory run deeper than rivers, such things never end cleanly. It is said that Seraphina did not die in the swamp. She simply changed form. That her spirit found new vessels, generation after generation, until she no longer belonged to one body, but to a lineage. A curse that ensured her story would never fade. That every woman who carried her shadow would know what it meant to be remembered and feared. Somewhere in Alabama, they say there are girls born with green eyes and a humming voice, who walk barefoot through the magnolia groves at night, unaware of the name that sleeps in their blood. And when the wind moves through the trees, the old ones listen carefully. Because sometimes, just before thunder, you can still hear her voice whisper through the leaves, "I am not your ghost. I am your history." By the early 1920s, the Old South had changed its clothes, but not its soul. The plantations were gone, but their shadows stretched far over the red Alabama clay. People called it progress, new churches, new factories, new hymns. Yet the sermons still trembled with the same ancient fear, the woman who would not die. Her name had become a whisper passed through generations, Seraphina. Mothers used it to scare their children into obedience. Preachers cursed it from pulpits, their voices shaking more from guilt than faith. But there was one man who could no longer hide from that name, Elias Pike, the son of Reverend Josiah Pike, the preacher who had once claimed to see Seraphina rise from the ashes of the Hale plantation. Elias grew up beneath the weight of his father's madness. The elder Pike had vanished one summer night in 1872, after his famous sermon about the angel made of sorrow. They found his Bible split in two, and his pulpit scorched as though lightning had struck indoors. His disappearance turned into legend, but for Elias, it was an inheritance of shame. By 1921, Elias was a preacher himself, not out of faith, but desperation. He preached in small wooden chapels outside Montgomery to congregations that smelled of tobacco and fear. But no matter how loud he shouted, he could not silence the dreams. Every night, he saw the same woman walking through fire, her eyes 2 green flames in the dark. One night, after another restless sermon, Elias sat alone in his church, listening to the cicadas outside. The candles had burned low when he heard the faintest hum, the tune his father had described before his disappearance. Soft, mournful, old as sin itself. He froze. "Who's there?" he called. No answer. Only the sound of bare feet on wooden floorboards. And then he saw her. At the back of the church stood a woman, dark-skinned, dressed in white, her face shadowed but unmistakably alive. Her hair fell long over her shoulders, and her eyes gleamed like polished moss. Elias felt the air thicken, his lungs tightening. "You," he whispered. She tilted her head slightly. "Your father saw me once," she said. Her voice was calm, low, filled with centuries. He thought I came to punish him. "But I only came to remind." Elias trembled. "You're not real," he said. "You're a story. A curse." Her faint smile deepened. "Stories are truer than men." She stepped closer. With each footfall, the candles flickered, their flames bowing toward her. "Your father confessed his sins to the earth," she continued. "But not his blood." "You carry what he hid." Elias shook his head. "I've done nothing wrong." "You were born wrong," she said softly, "because your line believed it could bury truth beneath scripture." Her hand brushed the old wooden altar, and the grain blackened under her touch. "The church filled with the scent of smoke and magnolia? What do you want?" Elias whispered. She looked at him then, really looked. And for a moment, he saw not just a woman, but a history too vast for words. Every lash, every scar, every whispered prayer beneath the stars, all of it burning in her gaze. "I want remembrance," she said, "not repentance." And then she vanished. The candles snuffed out, the air empty but for her scent. Elias fled the church and didn't stop running until dawn. He collapsed in a field outside town, his clothes soaked in dew. When he awoke, he thought it a nightmare, until he saw the black ribbon tied around his wrist. For weeks after, he refused to preach. He locked himself in his parsonage, writing furiously in his journals, trying to reason the madness away. But the more he wrote, the less human his words became. Parishioners heard him muttering to himself, "She waits for me. She waits for all of us." Then came the confession. One humid evening, Elias walked into the same church where he'd first seen her. He locked the doors and began to speak aloud, as if delivering his final sermon. Though no one was there to hear it but the ghosts, he confessed everything, not his own sins, but his father's. His father, Josiah Pike, had not simply seen Seraphina that night in 1872. He had known her before, when he was a young man, before his collar, before the Bible. He'd been one of the men who helped hunt her after her escape from the asylum. He'd watched her chained in the doctor's wagon, silent, defiant. He'd called her the devil's woman, while the doctor bled her with leeches in the name of medicine. And when the fire consumed the asylum, he'd seen her walk out through the flames, untouched. That was the moment his faith broke. The rest of his life was an apology he could never finish. Elias wept as he spoke. "My father was not haunted by her," he said. "He was forgiven, and it destroyed him." Then his voice fell to a whisper. "And now she comes for me." No one knows what happened next. When parishioners arrived the next morning, the church was filled with the smell of wet earth and ash. The altar was cracked, and Elias Pike was gone. Only his journal remained, open to the last page, a single line written in a trembling hand. She stood beside me, and I saw myself in her eyes, not as a man, but as a memory. Years later, during renovations, the church's new pastor found something beneath the floorboards, a small silver locket, identical to the one found decades earlier in Clara Wyndham's possession. Inside, a piece of paper read, "I wait in every generation." The locket was sent to a museum in Montgomery, but it vanished before the exhibit opened. Some say the curator heard humming the night before and quit her job without explanation. As time passed, the story of Reverend Pike's son faded into the folds of Southern legend, another ghost in the archives. Yet those who study old Alabama folklore still note the strange connection. Every 50 years, another witness, another disappearance, another black ribbon. It is said that the descendants of Elias Pike moved north, changed their name, and never spoke of Alabama again. But in every family photograph, there's always one woman with eyes that seem too bright, too knowing, too green, and when night falls over the fields of Montgomery County, when the wind stirs the magnolia trees, some swear they can hear the echo of a sermon that never ended. Forgive us, for she remembers what we tried to forget. By the time the 20th century began to die, the story of Seraphina had become nothing more than folklore to most. A ghost whispered about on porches, a warning told to children who wandered too far into the woods. Alabama had grown louder, brighter, more modern, but its ghosts never left. They simply learned to hide in electricity and silence. In the summer of 1964, during the height of the civil rights movement, a journalist named Henry Caldwell came to Montgomery from New York. He'd been sent to write about protests, marches, and songs of freedom. But he found himself drawn to something else, the ruins of the old Hale plantation, long overgrown and forgotten by maps. Local people warned him not to go. "That land ain't right," one elderly man told him. "Things buried there don't stay quiet." Henry laughed it off. He was a rational man, northern-born, college-educated, immune to superstition. But the more he heard the name Seraphina, the more it haunted his notes, like a stain he couldn't erase. One evening, Henry visited the county archive in Selma to dig through property records. There, he found an old plantation ledger with a torn page tucked inside. It was a letter written in 1849, signed by Caroline Hale, the mistress of the house, the woman rumored to have died of poisoned tea. The letter read, "If I am gone when you find this, know that she was not wicked. She was free long before any of us understood the word, and she will not rest until this place forgets how to enslave." The handwriting stopped mid-sentence, as though the pen had been torn away. That night, Henry couldn't sleep. The rain hammered his window like knuckles. Just before dawn, he dreamed of a woman standing beneath a magnolia tree, her white dress soaked in blood and moonlight. When lightning flashed, she looked up, and her eyes were the color of the river after a storm. The next morning, Henry drove to the old plantation. The fields were nothing but ghosts of rose, the house a pile of bones half swallowed by kudzu. The magnolia tree still stood, its trunk twisted, its roots deep and black with rot. As he approached, he saw something strange at its base, a stone marker, old but uncarved, and beside it a half-buried chain. He knelt to touch the chain, and the world changed. The air grew heavy, the cicadas fell silent, and a low hum began to fill the space between his ears. Soft, rhythmic, the same melody that had threaded through Alabama for a century. He turned, and there she was, barefoot, ageless, her face neither young nor old, her skin glowing faintly in the dim light. The white dress clung to her like mist. "You're her," Henry whispered. She looked at him, calm, knowing. "I am what remains when truth refuses to die." He wanted to run, but his legs would not move. "You carry questions," she said. "Ask them," his voice trembled. "Why here? Why me?" She smiled, not kindly but not cruelly. "Because you write," she said. "And stories make graves shallow." Then she touched the magnolia tree. The bark shimmered, and for a heartbeat, Henry saw visions, men in chains, women screaming, flames devouring the house, a preacher burning his Bible, a doctor writing in fear, a young girl humming in an asylum cell. All the generations, all the sins, stacked like stones beneath this tree. "This is where it began," she said. "And where it ends?" Henry fell to his knees. "What do you want from me?" Her voice turned low, almost human. "To be remembered, not as curse or ghost, but as proof." She stepped closer, until her breath brushed his face. "Write the truth," she said. "Tell them what they buried." And then she was gone. The wind rose, tearing leaves from the magnolia. The ground began to smoke. Henry stumbled back as the tree's trunk split open, glowing from within, fire licking up through the branches, turning blossoms into ash. The air filled with the scent of burning flowers. By the time the firemen arrived, there was nothing left but blackened soil and the faint outline of a woman's footprint burned into the earth. Henry was never the same. He returned to New York, quit journalism, and began writing a book titled The Burning Magnolia, The Untold History of Alabama's Darkest Ghost. He never finished it. He was found dead in his study one night, his face calm, his pen still in his hand. The manuscript contained only one complete paragraph. She was no ghost. She was the memory of a nation that refused to see itself. Her beauty was not her weapon, it was her mirror. When his family collected his belongings, they found a black ribbon wrapped around his wrist. Years later, a professor at Howard University discovered Henry's notes among archived papers. She published them as the Seraphina Testament, reigniting the legend for a new generation. Civil rights activists quoted her story as a symbol of endurance. Poets called her the flame that refused to die. But in Alabama, the old people still whispered the older version, that she still walked when magnolias bloomed white, that her hum was the sound of chains melting in the soil. In 1987, a construction crew clearing land for a highway near Montgomery unearthed a small wooden box beneath a charred magnolia stump. Inside was a silver locket, a black ribbon, and a folded piece of parchment. The writing was faint but clear. "For every generation that forgets, I will return." The workers refused to finish the job. The site was quietly reburied, fenced off, and listed as a protected historical zone. Officially, it was to preserve local ecology. Unofficially, no one wanted to disturb what slept beneath it. Today, travelers who pass that stretch of highway say their radios flicker when they draw near. Some swear they hear a woman's voice, soft as wind, humming through the static. No one sees her. Not fully, well, just the outline of a white dress in the corner of the eye. But if you step out, and listen closely beneath the hum of tires and time, you might hear her words through the whispering trees. "You built your world on my bones, and yet you call me ghost." Then silence. The magnolia still grows there, its blossoms pale as ghosts, its roots black as guilt. And on quiet nights, the air smells faintly of smoke, the perfume of remembrance. Because Seraphina never sought vengeance. She sought to be unforgotten. And in Alabama, where every field hides a story, her name still blooms like fire in the dark.